Ladies and gentlemen, thank you and welcome to West of England. Some of you will know who attended before. This is part 2 of our bunker-related seminars that we're hosting. Our last one was in November on a technical off-spec bunkers, and today Rory Butler and Alessio Spraga from HFW in London have kindly agreed to come here to talk about the sulphur cap on the 1st of January 2020 Marple Annex 6 introduction of the low sulphur requirements. Alessio and both of you are on Paul Dean was on the BIMCO drafting committee for the BIMCO clauses of low sulphur that were published just before Christmas. So if any of you have any burning questions about the clauses or how they came into play, or any issues you think may have been missed out, or any other comments about the clauses, these two are the people to talk to and ask about. So over to you.
Any criticisms, you can blame Alessio for the
clauses. If you've got any questions, you can ask throughout, and also there will be a handout at the end if you want one as well.
Thank you, Nicola. Okay. No? Unfortunate. It was working. Well, shall I? Well, I think you've all got the paper handout anyway, so it was a good job we brought that along as the foolproof option. Why don't I just start and then we'll catch up with the PowerPoint on the screen when we can. So, first thing to do is just to introduce what HFW have been doing, just to give you a bit of background. I think we started at least probably about 12 months or more ago. And this was way before we drafted the BIMCO clause, because we found some of our clients that had long-term COAs or other long-term time charters they were going to enter into wanted clauses to be drafted before the BIMCO clause. So, as well as Alessio and BIMCO with their clause, we've been drafting a sort of wide variety of clauses beforehand. And that's been for a mix of people. So it's been for container lines, as charterers, it's been for tonnage providers, been for trading houses, and a real mix of different clients. So we've seen clauses from all different sides of the spectrum. And in terms of who came to us first, it was big container lines and the big bulker operators, because they were looking at very high exposure in terms of the price differential for bunkers, and so they've been looking at this for probably a couple of years now, some of them. And as I say, in terms of what we've done the BIMCO 2020 clause, Alessio and Paul Dean. We've drafted charter focus clauses for trading houses, mining companies, big container lines. We've done more recently quite a lot of scrubber purchase contracts, where we've been helping owners enter into scrubber purchase contracts, and we've been helping charterers basically enter into scrubber purchase contracts, then assign them across to owners. That's been quite popular, where you've got a charter that faces a big fuel price exposure under a long-term charter. They've sometimes contracted to buy scrubbers, then assigned them across to the owner, and then amended the charter party to deal with it. So a few of those deals, and also retrofitting of scrubbers from the owner's side. So that's what we've been doing. Next slide is what will this talk cover. This talk is going to cover the rules very briefly, because you already know probably quite a lot about that. We're going to talk about the issues that come up and how you can comply with the sulphur cap, what clauses need to deal with. We're going to talk about the BIMCO clause, and as you know, there's two BIMCO clauses. There's the compliance clause and the transition clause. So we'll talk about both of those, and then finally we'll move on to talk about scrubbers, different types, the bans, the kind of clauses you might need to include in charter parties to deal with scrubbers, and the deals I just mentioned where you're fitting scrubbers to existing vessels and amending existing charters. So those are the sort of 4 broad areas we're going to cover. So I can hand over to Alessio now for the bit about the regulations.
Thank you, Rory. Good afternoon, everybody. So, to set the scene, start with a quick recap of the applicable provisions of Marple Annex 6 and how that's likely to affect the 2020 sulphur cap. So the obvious starting point here is Regulation 14.1, the general requirement, which provides that sulphur content of any fuel used on board ships shall not exceed 0.50% with effect from January 2020, the so-called 2020 sulphur cap. Reference to a ship, well, it's quite a broad definition, as you will see in your hand. It represents a vessel of any type whatsoever operating in the marine environment, and applies also to floating craft and fixed or floating objects. As for what is fuel oil, well, That means any fuel delivered to and intended for the combustion purposes for propulsion and use on board the vessel, including distillates and residuals. So it therefore applies to any fuel used on board in the main engine, the auxiliary engine, and also the boilers. Aside from that, there is not only one type of compliant fuel out there. There can be alternative fuel oils, provided they are at least as efficient in terms of emission reductions.
Okay, just use the keyboard.
Use the keyboard.
Just going, use the arrows to go backwards and forwards.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to position yourself, Alessia?
Yeah, of course. I'll play catch up now. So. Right. Where are we? Right, so we're here. So the various types of compliant fuels that are out there, as some of you probably already know, distillate fuels, MGO, MDO, and then we have hybrid or blended fuels. Blended fuels being those blends between heavy distillate and light residuals, or new residuals, HFO from sweet crudes or HFO that has undergone desulfurization. Aside from that, LNG is also an alternative, probably more expensive, and also methanol, biofuels, LPG and hydrocarbon fuel cells. And then there is also alternative abatement technology and the use of exhaust gas cleaning systems, scrubbers, which Rory will come on to later, provided, however, they are at least, again, effective in terms of emission reductions, and which have been approved by the administration, that being the flag state government. It is also important to bear in mind that Annex 6, the Sulphur 2020 cap, has a wide sphere of application. It applies to any trades which involve ships calling at MARPOL Convention states and any ships which fly the flag of a MARPOL Convention state. And as you will see from the following representation on the map, it very much is a global cap. However, what you'll probably also note from this map in front of you is that there are some cabotage and local trade areas where it would be possible to supply different sulphur content fuel and not need to comply with MARPOL Annex 6. However, caution would be exerted here because at the end of the day, it would need for the ship not to be of a flag state of MARPOL, and would also need to bear in mind that there are other alternative sulphur emission regimes out there that differ from MARPOL Annex 6. So who is responsible for compliance? Well, primary responsibility always rests with the ship owners, and this is normally reflected in charter party provisions. So, for example, quite often you see in charter party provisions clauses which provide for warranties that are given by the owners to comply with local regulations and laws. Notwithstanding this, however, it is still possible to allocate the cost and risk of compliance under the contract itself, and that is precisely what we're going to come on to shortly in the context of the BIMCO clauses. There are also additional requirements to be aware of. Fuel oil availability. If a vessel, for example, is found to be non-compliant because compliant fuel is not available, vessels are obliged to provide a record of actions taken to achieve compliance and evidence that best efforts were actually made to purchase compliant fuel in the event. This obligation is primarily on the ship owners, so you can see how there could be a potential tension going forward in circumstances where, under a time charter, the owner delegates responsibility for putting fuel on board to the time charter. 18.2 also provides that the vessel should not be required to deviate from the voyage to achieve compliance. However, the query that you have to answer is whether vessels may choose to do this in any event. And why is that? Well, at present, the risk of non-compliance and the consequences arising from that are relatively unclear. So most owners would not want to take that chance. Aside from that, fuel oil quality. Compliant fuel oil shall not include any substance or any chemical waste which jeopardizes the safety of ships or adversely affects the performance of the machinery. It is also important to be aware of other additional important considerations, in particular that of the carriage ban. Now, as you're probably aware, at MEPC 73 in October, the IMO decided to follow through with the prohibition on carriage of fuel oil of above 0.50% sulphur content for use in fuel tanks with effect from the 1st of March 2020. That applies to all vessels except where the vessel is fitted with a scrubber and that scrubber is operational. So it's a very important consideration to be aware of. Aside from that, it's important also not to forget that the MARPOL Annex 6 applies to more than just the 2020 sulphur cap. Of course, there are other existing areas out there that have sulphur content regime requirements, including ECAs. And aside from that, outside of Annex 6, there are also separate regimes where sulphur content is regulated. US, the EU under the EU Sulphur Directive, China, Hong Kong, and many others. And on that note, I'll hand over to Rory.
Thank you. So in terms of policing and enforcement, the most important thing is obviously the carriage ban. And that was the thing that the Trident Alliance and a lot of the industry bodies lobbied hard to get the carriage ban, because that's the easiest way to find a ship with the wrong type of fuel on board and they haven't got a scrubber, then they're automatically going to be in breach. There's no reason for them to be carrying that fuel on board, at least after March 2020. In terms of who's going to do the enforcement, this was the other big issue that a lot of the pressure groups were looking at. And obviously, in port, it will be the port state control. It will be the contracting states, for the Paris and Tokyo memorandums. However, when the ships are on the open sea, it will be the flag state. And there's been a lot of, the flag states, some have a more direct approach to enforcement than others. It will be a new thing for them to potentially enforce in some cases. And there's some uncertainty about how active they will be in doing that and setting fines for that, because obviously, where a breach happens outside a particular territorial jurisdiction, it will be a flag matter rather than a port state control matter. And although it's easy in theory to tell whether a vessel's breached the rules, because you've got the carriage ban, you've got bunker delivery notes, you've got vessel documents, potentially tank sampling, it does depend in a large part on the inspectors and the people going on board being rigorous, not being bribed, not being given fake documents or fake information. So there is still the potential for people to take risks. And also, a bit like a burglar that gets caught one in 50 times but carries on offending, there may be some owners that, that decide to take the risk, and if the enforcement regime is not that high, and see what fines are, and effectively, if there's a big price differential, take the risk on the fines. So that brings me on to fines. People don't really know yet what the fines will be set at, what the levels will be. The MARPOL guidance itself on fines calls for fines that are adequate in severity to discourage violations. And the EU Sulphur Directive says the principle of fines is to deprive those responsible from the economic benefits from the breach, and the fines would be increased against repeat offenders. You can see a scenario, if you just find some of the difference between high sulphur and low sulphur fuel, that wouldn't really act as a deterrent, because you might decide simply to take the risk if you are willing to break the rules. On the other hand, if you go down the US approach, where you've got the US magic pipe cases and the MARPOL violations there, it's not uncommon to see fines of 2 to 5 million, even for something where there isn't sort of deliberate intent. And you could get much higher fines if there's a deliberate intent or there's a corporate policy behind it. So, if you're looking at those sorts of fines, that would clearly act as a deterrent if you're getting fined millions of dollars for breach of these regulations. If, on the other hand, you're getting fined $10,000, it's not really much of a deterrent. So that's something that is slightly unknown. There's also the issue on repeat offenders, because the idea is that port state control regimes will exchange information about repeat offenders. So if you have got a particular operator or manager that is regularly being flagged for breaching the regulations, you may see an increased inspection regime, potentially a ban of those vessels from ports if things are operating efficiently. And in terms of the ship, when the port state control inspectors come on board, one of the things that the regulators are recommending, it's not mandatory, is that the ship has a ship implementation plan, which would cover the risks associated with new fuel, modifications to the ship, documents and reporting requirements, capacity and segregation issues, changeover of fuels, and how you're going to procure compliant fuels. And the idea is, if you've got a proper shipboard implementation plan and good records, that might, if you're being inspected, be of help if there is a breach, because you say, well, there's a breach, but we've got proper procedures, we were trying to avoid a problem. Whereas if the inspector comes on board, you've got no procedures, bad documents, and you're in breach, then you're facing an uphill battle. Carrying on, covered some of this already. I mean, perhaps the role of technology as well. Where you have a scrubber fitted, my understanding is that you're meant to have emissions monitoring at the funnel to check that the scrubber is working. That will be recorded on board, and it has to be recorded in a sort of secure manner. One question mark is, well, will eventually all ships be fitted with technology that's monitoring what's being burned, what fuel is, what the emissions are from every ship? Will that be tamper-proof? Also, you've got sniffer devices fitted on bridges and monitoring in ports to check for compliance. So as technology gets more advanced, there'll be perhaps new ways to enforce the regulations. And also whistleblowing. I mean, what we've seen with the US Magic Pipe case is that crew members can get large rewards for whistleblowing. I don't know whether that will become a factor with 2020 issues, but you can see if it is, that might be something that would encourage compliance, or at least lead to prosecutions and so on. And then finally, in terms of insurers, and this is a new issue for insurers as well, but our suspicion is that people will probably treat it in the same way as the Magic Pipe violations, in the sense that there wouldn't be cover for things like fines, and there is a risk it could jeopardise your insurance cover. However, under English law, at least from the Hull point of view, if we look at Hull now more than P&I, you have got the new Insurance Act, and if you have a breach of warranty, so for example a ship has to have an international air pollution certificate, has to be in accordance with class, flag and other regulatory requirements. If you're not complying with that, you can be in breach of your insurance policy. In the old days, that might void your entire marine insurance cover, so you have no cover. Whereas now, under the new Insurance Act, there's an argument that an owner would make, well, yes, there may be a breach, but it's not causative of the particular loss, and therefore you would argue that you're not losing your hull cover. So the position on hull cover is probably a lot better than it used to be because of the Insurance Act if there's a breach. And the position on P&I cover is probably likely to be that clubs are not covering things like fines. However, there's going to be a grey area where if a member is unlucky perhaps, so say they're supplied with bunkers that are tested, they look fine, they've got good procedures, but it just turns out they're bad bunkers, they're not as tested, or the owner's done everything they can, but they're in breach of the regulations, maybe by a small degree, but they've done everything they could have done. There may be discretionary elements there in the same way that there sometimes are on other issues. But I think that the message is, if you don't comply with the regulations, you are taking a risk on insurance coverage. And then finally, to pick up on Alessio's point about deviation, I would strongly recommend that people have rights to deviate in bills of lading, charter parties and other contracts to bunker fuel, even if you don't have to deviate to comply with the regulations. If you're sailing right past Singapore, you can't get low sulphur bunkers, and you're sailing right past Singapore on the way to the States, might it not be prudent to stop in and bunker rather than turn up at the States and say, hey, we couldn't get any low sulphur bunkers? I think we've got to be sort of realistic about these things. And then the final thing on this is there is a form that's being developed called a fuel or non-availability report. And what's interesting in there is when you look at the draft form that's being developed, it says which suppliers have you contacted to try and get low sulphur bunkers, and there's a space for suppliers meant to have contacted. And it also says what actions have you taken to achieve compliance, why was fuel not available? And you have to say when you're next going to be able to get compliant fuel. So if you are going to say we couldn't get fuel, there is going to be an evidential process that you have to go through to support it. Okay, we can cover this fairly briefly, but probably 18 months ago we had various questions from owners and charterers about who pays for low sulphur bunkers, where does the risk lie? And there have been some extreme cases where, under, say, a time charter, there might be an argument that an owner has to pay for low sulphur fuel because it's a very unusual charter. I think in 99% of cases it's a charterer's issue. It's for charterers to pay for the fuel. It would obviously be different if you had to fit a scrubber. You'd then be into a vessel modification issue, but you don't. What's of more interest is we've seen some clients with long-term contracts of affreightment, where there's a bunker adjustment factor that's referenced to IFO 380 or IFO 380 Plat Singapore. And in that scenario, you can see that probably the obligation to pay for the additional cost of low sulphur fuel is on the owner. And if you've got a 5 or a 10-year contract, that's a potentially huge exposure. So I think, as a general rule, in a time charter context, this is really an issue for charterers to pay for the bunkers, and in a void charter or COA context, it's more likely to be for the owners, but there are shades of grey in between. But it's not just who pays for the bunkers, it's also who takes on the risk. In terms of significant issues, how do you comply? Alessio has already covered the different methods of compliance. Who supplies the fuel? Who pays for it? Does an owner have to install scrubbers? No, because there's alternative methods of compliance available in buying low sulphur fuel. When you use this type of fuel, there's other issues which we'll come on to. Is will it damage the engine? Will it affect performance warranties? Are blends okay? Can you segregate on board the different qualities of fuel? Even if you have a scrubber, now you have the ban on scrubbers, you may need to have different grades of fuel on board. Is there enough tank capacity? So there are practical and operational issues. We've got the availability of fuel, and it's not just the MARPOL zones, as Alessio said, there's lots of other zones that can impose other regulations. And I think the key thing that we want to get across is you need to look at the charter and the contract as a whole. Just dropping in the BIMCO clause is definitely not enough. You need to look at the whole contract, all the bunker clauses, and there may be unintended consequences of modifying the contract that you need to consider. Also, your bunker supply terms as well are well worth revisiting. So I'll hand back to Alessio for the clause.
Right. So on the screen you'll see the BIMCO compliance clause, shorthand way of describing it. I'm sure most of you have had a chance to have a look at it already, but for those of you who haven't, I'll give you a few moments. And I'm sure a lot of you will have questions on it, no doubt, that and the BIMCO fuel transition clause. But before getting into the meat of the clauses themselves, it would probably be appropriate to talk about the scope, to understand why it came into being, what it intends to cover. So in essence, it replaces the BIMCO fuel sulphur content clause 2005. It has broadly similar provisions, but important amendments and additions. Why? Because it's been adapted to meet the new MARPOL global regime in order to meet other additional existing regimes. At its core, it is a general compliance clause, clearly identifying the obligations between the parties so that there can be no misunderstanding as to what responsibilities each party has. And from my point of view, and probably from the subcommittee's point of view, we thought it was a fair, a reasonable reflection of the existing time charter party regime and the risks that both parties were likely to take in terms of going on the commercial adventure towards January 2020. And the makeup of the subcommittee being that of ship owners, charterers, fuel suppliers, pool managers, and also technical experts and lawyers meant that it was likely to have a broad mix between various interests. In terms of its application, well, it's capable of application to time charter parties as of today, as well as from 2020 onwards. So it can be applied right now. However, it is not intended to address the one-off event, which is the transition period, or the carriage ban, which the separate BIMCO fuel transition clause deals with. It also is not intended to apply to issues of fuel compatibility and suitability. And this is because this is effectively a separate issue from sulphur content. And the focus of the clause is clearly on sulphur content, but also because the issues of compatibility and suitability are not new issues. They may become more complicated as a result of the different compliant fuels coming onto the market, but it's certainly something that's already been provided for in most of the contracts that I've seen in terms of rider clauses, in terms of how to deal with them. And it's also important to be aware that BIMCO also has its own existing bunker clauses, such as the bunker operation and sampling clause and the bunker quality and liability clause, which could apply to those kind of situations. And I've certainly, I'm not sure about Rory, but I've certainly seen them amended in various different charter parties. The clause also does not apply to voyage charter parties and contracts of affreightment. It also doesn't apply to vessels fitted with scrubbers because it involves different issues, which Rory will come on to. But also potentially it doesn't involve or affect or impact time charter party trips where, for example, the charterers do not supply the fuel themselves. Dealing with the sub-clauses in turn, the definition is now clear and firmly focused on sulphur content requirements. It represents a clear shift of focus away from geographical zones and areas. And why? Well, this was felt to be an important and necessary shift because, firstly, it fits in with the evolving global emissions regime. As we've covered, the 2020 sulphur cap and the sulphur emission requirements applies by virtue of the ship's flag and applies to those waters which belong to MARPOL states. So therefore, the focus of Annex 6 is no longer limited to geographical areas. Secondly, it also promotes contractual certainty and avoids possible arguments on construction, which, for example, was possible on the 2005 BIMCO clause wording, which appears to have been drafted with ECAs in mind. The sulphur content requirements therefore have a broad definition to cover two main issues. One, it covers actual sulphur content limits imposed by MARPOL and imposed by other lawful authorities. Secondly, but importantly, it also includes the word related requirements, which should be broad enough to cover documentation required by MARPOL and other sulphur content regimes, insofar as it relates to the sulphur content requirement. So, for example, it most likely will cover Regulation 14.5 and the necessary requirements that go into the provision of a bunker delivery node. It also may help in requiring charterers to assist in collection of evidence in circumstances where there is an unavailability of compliant fuel, which, as Rory said, could be a possibility come 2020. It is also potentially arguable that it covers minimum fuel or quality requirements, but that would have to be revisited in due course, as on a case-by-case basis. Subclause B. Well, Subclause B provides that charterers shall supply the vessel with fuel that will permit her at all times to comply with any applicable sulphur content requirements. In doing so, the clause clearly identifies that it is charterer's obligation to supply a compliant low sulphur fuel oil, therefore reinforcing existing time charter party provisions in pro forma charter parties. But also, it is to provide fuel which complies with the related documentary requirements, as we covered. The clause, however, does not specify the type of fuel to be used. This is intentional, because there are many forms of compliant fuel out there and different methods of compliance. However, what the clause does also do is it includes the additional words, all such fuels are to meet specifications and grades set out in the charter party. Now, this could be an important provision because it appreciates the fact that charter party may specifically already provide for the specification and grade of fuel to be supplied. In other words, the parties may already have decided what type of compliant fuel and specification and grade they want to be applied. So, for example, in the case where an owner has decided that he only wants to have MGO on board in order to comply with the sulphur content requirements, then it would not be possible for the charterer to then insist that he is in a position to provide any type of compliant fuel, which could be, for example, hybrids and blends. In circumstances where, for example, the owner's probably decided to go for distillate or MGO on the basis that they were unsure or not necessarily happy with putting on board hybrid and blends, given that those kind of fuels are very scarce on the market at the moment. A couple of other points on Clause B, Subclause B. It is also a point to note that there is an obligation to supply fuels to enable compliance at all times. This again is also potentially important because if a vessel is trading through into January 2020, it is implicit that sufficient compliant fuel will need to be on board the vessel to enable charterers to comply with their obligation come 1st of January 2020. Now, as we will come on to, if, as BIMCO has suggested to members, that both clauses to be incorporated into the charter party, this issue would not arise, and we'll come on to that. But if there was a situation, for example, where only one of the clauses was incorporated, it is possible that this kind of provision could be used to say that charterers need to provide sufficient compliant fuel on board in order to meet their obligations by 1st of January, when the sulphur cap comes into operation. Further, there also continues to be a charterer's warranty that bunker suppliers and operators used will comply with the sulphur content requirements. Now, this is a similar provision to that which was found in the 2005 and makes clear that to charterers that there is a duty of care in terms of those fuel suppliers that they use to supply fuel to the vessel. Lastly, in terms of the indemnity, well, there was in the 2005 version also an indemnity provision there, but here there have been some important amendments to be aware of. And of course, this is owner focused, and I will come on to the charter elements in subclause C. But in terms of the amendments made to this indemnity provision, you'll notice that there's expanded wording. If I go back to it, you'll probably see expanded wording. You'll see the addition of the word deviation, which, touching upon what Rory said, should cover a situation where compliant fuel is not available, and deviation is actually required under Regulation 18.2. The existence of the indemnity provision also may incentivise charterers to assist with documentary requirements. Aside from that, the addition to the words to remain on hire throughout also makes clear that any time lost as a result of charterers' failure to comply with their obligations will be treated as on hire. Subclause C. Now, this clause very clearly sets out owner's responsibility. It should be noted that owner's responsibility to comply with Annex 6 is not dependent on charterers supplying the required sulphur fuel content. It is a freestanding obligation and a restatement of the regulatory compliance which remains at all times with owners. So as a result, owners remain responsible for fuel management. Some of you may also note there is no warranty that the vessel shall be able to consume fuels with the required sulphur content. Similar wording to that which was found in the 2005 version. Now, the reason that this didn't make it into the clause was because it was considered too extensive an undertaking, given the concern on potential additional properties of new fuel coming onto the market. So, for example, where it may be possible to have compliant and on specification and correct grade fuel oil, but still not be suitable to be burned because it contains additional properties. And that would reflect an unreasonable undertaking by the owners in such circumstances. The essence of the clause, however, is that owners will be responsible for compliance with Annex 6, unless this non-compliance has been caused by the charterer's failure to comply with their obligations under subclause B. And lastly, for those eagle-eyed people out there, that there is no provision or reciprocal indemnity for charterers. Now, this was something that was considered in depth by the committee, but at the end of the day, it was decided that it was not appropriate in the circumstances to provide a reciprocal indemnity for the charterers. And the thinking was that an indemnity is appropriate on the one hand for the owners because of the increased risk that they were taking in terms of delegating responsibility for putting on fuel on board, whilst at the same time remaining responsible for regulatory compliance. However, the indemnity wording in favour of the charterers would risk elevating charterers' cause of action to a special status in circumstances where they arguably were not taking as much risk as the owners in terms of the commercial adventure. And in any event, it is traditional practice in time charterers for warranties to be given for compliance with international regulations. And the charterers, of course, would be able to prosecute their claim in the normal way by way of breach of contract if owners did not comply with MARPOL Annex 6. Thank you all.
We've covered some of these already, but there's nothing really, in my view, wrong with the sort of DIMCO clause per se. It's a good starting point. I can say this because I wasn't on the committee, and we've advised charterers and owners and all sorts of different parties on it. I think it's a good clause. I think the problem with it is it's what it doesn't cover, and it's obviously trying to be all things to all people. And if you've got particular deals, particular charter parties, particular relationships, particular trades, it needs to be amended, and it needs to fit in with other charter clauses. You can't just drop it in and think the job is done. But also, you mustn't forget about COAs and voyage charters. They do need amending in some cases as well. In a voyage charter context, for example, you may just want to insert a simple clause making clear that the risk is on owners. They have to indemnify charterers if there's any consequences of owners not complying with the regulations. Just be clear where it lies. With the COA, you're going to have to change some of the pricing provisions and things like that, and also look at availability issues of fuel, rights to deviate. So, there are things that are still relevant in the COA context as well. And obviously, there's lots more vessels are being fitted with scrubbers. One of the problems we see with the BIMCO clause is if people just drop this into a charter and then there's a vessel that is fitted with a scrubber that has this clause and it doesn't work. So what we've tried to do in some cases for some of our mining trading clients is develop a clause that can be used with vessels that are fitted with and without scrubbers. So effectively it's a sort of all-purpose clause from a charterer's point of view and deals with both permutations, which is obviously sensible because if you have a COA, you could be taking vessels that are fitted with one or other. Also, this is a new issue. New issue is going to crop up. The BIMCO clause is probably going to have to be reviewed, in due course once the lay of the land is clear. And the other concern I have about the BIMCO clause is that it's not necessarily fully future-proof because new regulations are coming in all the time. It only addresses sulphur. It doesn't address air pollution more generally, like nitrogen oxide and so on and so forth. And therefore, if you're entering a 5 or a 10-year charter, the chances are that things will change in that 5 to 10-year period. And actually, this clause wouldn't be covering you. So our recommendation normally from an owner's side, when you're doing a long-term charter, is to have some sort of compulsory modifications clause in it, where you're sharing the risk of regulatory changes with the charterer, where you're doing that sort of long-term enterprise. And obviously, as Alessia has already said, it doesn't address blended fuel, it doesn't address suitability issues, and those are something that an owner may be quite concerned with. If you have an older ship, query, are all fuels going to be suitable? Are blends going to be suitable? Is it going to affect the performance warranty? So these are things that need to be thought about. And from a charterer's perspective, you may want to try and insert an indemnity. Let's say it's given the reasons why that wasn't included. But from a charterer's point of view, you may say, well, if the owners are getting an indemnity, I'll have one too. And the other thing I should say is the BIMCO bunker clauses themselves aren't always used by everyone, and so if you drop this clause in, you need to make sure that the things that are covered by the other BIMCO clauses are also covered. And I understand that the BIMCO clauses, the bunker clauses, may be updated in due course, so they may be changing as well. Some example clauses. One of the issues I've already talked about is the clauses just aimed at sulphur, and so there is an argument you should have a wider definition to deal with nitrogen oxide emission zones, make it as wide as possible to try and future-proof the provision. That's good and bad. From an owner's point of view, it might be bad because it kind of widens their exposure in terms of what the vessel has to comply with. But it's also good because it puts the risk of getting fuel that complies with very wide regulatory requirements onto the charterers. So as I say, that's one potential gap, and we have seen people starting to put things to do with nitrogen and other air pollution requirements into charters rather than just dealing with sulphur. And then on suitability, I mean, from an owner's point of view, you may want to say the fuels have got to be suitable for use in the vessel's main engine. From a charterer's point of view, you may want to say, well, actually, owners warrant that the vessel can burn these types of fuels, blends and other things that the charterers may want to supply. And as I say, I think for a new charter party, for a newer vessel, if I was a charterer, I'd try and sort of say, well, owners will warrant they can sort of burn these types of fuels, which gives you as much latitude as possible. We've talked about the effect on performance already, but it's not really known what effect it will have on performance. We've heard mixed things from clients. Some clients have suggested these types of new bunkers might require extra heating, extra power. Others have said that the calorific and density values might have an adverse impact on vessel performance. From an owner's point of view, if you can negotiate a clause in there that says to the extent that the supply of different bunkers has an effect on vessel performance, we're not liable, we're not in breach of warranty, that would be a good thing. And then also the ISO standard, there is no ISO standard as yet for low sulphur fuel, but I understand the party line that ISO have taken is that ISO 8217 covers these types of fuels from a technical and operational perspective and can work with low sulphur fuels. So it's not necessarily known whether they will produce an ISO standard for this type of fuel specifically. But what they are doing is they're producing, I understand, a publicly available standard that addresses issues arising out of low sulphur fuel. And so maybe in due course, when that's fully available and there's more testing and information known, perhaps people will start incorporating additional requirements on the technical side from that into charter parties, or saying fuel must be compliant with the publicly available standard. Other miscellaneous provisions, the vessel should obviously be entered in the fuel testing programme. It would be unwise just to burn bunkers on the say-so of the bunker supplier who says these are definitely low sulphur. I think it would be very unwise, to do that. You want to have them tested for sulphur content, ideally before you use them, and that would be prudent to include that in the charter party. And obviously segregation is key. If you're the charterer, you don't want fuels, especially if you've got high and low sulphur fuels mixed. You want to keep everything separate. But because people expect there may be compatibility issues between different types of low sulphur fuel, you also want to keep those low sulphur fuels themselves separate within the vessel's segregation. And then finally, obviously, it's stating the obvious, but if you're a charterer taking delivery of a vessel, you don't want to be responsible for bunkers that are already on board. So if they're defective, you'd say, well, that's the owner's problem, and it's for the owner to sort that out with the previous charterer. I think that's implicit in the BIMCO clause because it talks about the charterers supplying bunkers, the inference being that you haven't supplied them, you're not liable, but you could include something to be sure. So back to Alessio and the transition clause.
Thank you, Rory. So as Rory has covered, of course we have the BIMCO compliance clause, but there are other additional considerations that you want to bear in mind given the issues going forward to 2020. In particular, that of the carriage ban date, and also those issues created particularly by the transition from high sulphur to low sulphur fuel oil. Such issues are acutely relevant to those time charter parties which are being entered into now and which span into 2020 and beyond, and which have not installed scrubbers. So the focus now is on those issues and how the BIMCO fuel transition clause fits into those issues, and whether again there are any other additional considerations to be aware of. So what are those issues? Some of you out there, of course, as members have probably already been grappling with these for the past couple of years, but to break them down broadly, they centre around operational, technical and commercial issues, and these issues are clearly interconnected and impact both owners and charterers. Unfortunately, existing charter party provisions are unlikely to provide a neat solution to those issues, and that is precisely the reason behind the types of clauses that have been produced by BIMCO. So in terms of the operational and technical issues, first you have preparation of the fuel system itself to receive, store and burn compliant fuel. This will involve tanks and pipeline cleaning potentially are likely to be essential, so to avoid high sulphur fuel residues on tank coatings contaminating compliant low sulphur fuel oil and resulting in non-compliance. And it may also minimise the possibility of compatibility and stability issues going forward. Where, how, when is this cleaning to be carried out? For example, is dry docking required? Can it be carried out by manual cleaning? Can it be carried out by chemical cleaning, additives, or a mixture of all the above? Questions like, is there actually a dry dock right under the charter party, or a right to take her out of service, are things that you should probably bear in mind. To what extent is cleaning required, and who bears the time, cost and risk of doing so in circumstances where existing charter party provisions are silent on this? In terms of fuel management, issues like what are the repercussions for storage and handling? What procedures should be followed in the event? What kind of quantities of high sulphur and compliant low sulphur fuel oil you need to be carried on board in the lead up to 2020, and for how long? How can this be managed on board? Aside from that, what impact will this have on tank capacity? Are there likely to be restrictions on tank capacity as a result of being trying to comply with the 2020 sulphur cap? Will it be necessary to bunker more often on your route? And segregation. Will it be necessary to segregate the new blends of compliant fuel? And are there likely to be issues with the quality of fuel? Potentially. And will this result in increased segregation in the event? The carriage ban. Now we've touched upon this before, and not wishing to go over old ground, it relates to the need to dispose of high sulphur fuel oil to be used in combustion purposes by the latest 1st of March 2020. Now, whilst it's not an exhaustive list, the issues are probably likely to centre around the following how and when and where to dispose of such fuel? Is there likely to be a limit in terms of the geographical ability for you to be able to dispose of this fuel? Will there be sufficient facilities ashore to receive such fuel if, for example, bunker suppliers have already started gearing up for January 2020 in the sense that they are going to supply more compliant low sulphur fuel? The reality is they will be cleaning their pumps and tanks in order to receive, store and supply that fuel rather than residual fuel. So there may also be shortages ashore to receive such cargo, or rather such fuel. Aside from that, are there likely to be local port regulations which would come into play? Potentially. And the value of such high sulphur fuel oil, is there likely to be a secondary market for them for the scrubbers? Potentially not, unless certain warranties are given. And more common issues that we tend to see with regards to bunkers, property to such bunkers. Have they been paid for before they've been disposed of? And then we have the commercial issues, broken down into price and availability of compliant fuel, both pre and post January 2020, what types of compliant fuel can be supplied, what is permitted under the charter party, and also what does this mean for the employment trading of the vessel? Who is likely to bear the risk of disruption and the limit on trade caused by technical or commercial reasons? So, for example, if a tank cleaning is actually required in the event, who bears the time, risk and cost of carrying that out, and what effect will that have on the vessel's trade? As you can see, it's not necessarily straightforward, and the transition from low sulphur to high sulphur, high sulphur to low sulphur, is likely to be a very big headache for everybody involved in the physical shipping chain, not just in terms of charter parties. But the only issue and the only thing to be grappled with is how to deal with it going forward. And this is not straightforward. Why? Because not all of the issues are aligned with each other, and there are a wide variety of scenarios to cater for, which largely will depend on the type and age of the vessel, the chosen method of compliance, and also the trade of that vessel. Therefore, it's likely to be important to strike the right balance in the charter party context between the parties. Why? Because existing regimes and existing provisions do not deal with this. These issues are important to have a robust contractual framework which at the same time requires and allows the parties to have a certain degree of flexibility in order to cooperate and achieve the specific aim, especially if we're talking about a long-term charter party. So why is cooperation essential? Well, it's clear from our review of those likely issues that there are competing interests in play. Indeed, it's not just simply a question of supplying compliant low sulphur fuel by the deadline, January 2020. It requires at least a minimum amount of compliant low sulphur fuel on board before January 2020. But in existing charter parties, that there is no express obligation on the charterers to stem compliant low sulphur fuel before that deadline. Plus, with the expected price differential that's likely to be seen in Q4 2019, we're probably going to see also quite a lot of charterers potentially wanting to delay the supply of compliant sulphur fuel until the very last moment possible, especially if they are looking to deliver just before 2020. The result of this is that it's likely to have a knock-on effect on preparation and planning, and notably tank cleaning to the extent it's required. And this, as we've seen, could also impact the vessel's trade. Therefore, it's clear from this that there's a role to be played by both parties. Charterers, in terms of responsibility for putting fuel on board and employment and trading of the vessel, and owners who are responsible for the fuel management and ensuring the vessel's tanks are capable of receiving, storing and burning the low sulphur compliant fuel. And on that basis, and on that background, we have the BIMCO Fuel Transition Clause, which, again, some of you may have seen already. I'll give you a chance to have a look at it in your handouts. Fortunately, I couldn't fit it on one page. Before jumping into the detail, probably a few words are probably appropriate to identify the scope and application and purpose of this clause. So the fuel transition clause is drafted with long-term charter parties, time charter parties, stretching into January 2020 in mind, and the one-off event, the transition period, and the carriage ban in the lead up to compliance. It's separate from the BIMCO compliance clause, but the guidance is that it should be applied in conjunction with that clause that we've covered. It is not, however, drafted for charter parties where vessels are to be redelivered prior to January 2020, or vessels which are fitted with scrubbers. There are alternative solutions for that, but this clause essentially does not provide for that. In terms of its key aims, well, it is intended to have a wide application, irrespective of vessel type and trade, to produce a robust contractual framework which achieves a reasonable and fair allocation, again, of risk and responsibility between the parties, and which could fit into an existing time charter party regime. At the same time, however, it is not prescriptive. And why? This is intentional, because it affords flexibility to the parties to coordinate and decide on important timing and operational matters, which are likely to vary from case to case, depending on the individual circumstance. Again, the vessel's age, trade, type of the vessel, and the method of compliance actually chosen. In terms of its key components, well, there is a clear and easy to understand overarching framework where minimum threshold obligations are imposed on each party to ensure compliance with the mandatory requirements and provisions of Annex 6, whilst at the same time providing the parties with sufficient flexibility to decide on what actually needs to be done with regard to that vessel and to meet their operational and timing needs. In terms of the mandatory provisions under Annex 6, well, they're quite straightforward. It's 1, to meet the 2020 sulphur cap, and 2, to meet the carriage ban from 1st of March 2020. As for the minimum thresholds, well, there are 3 main areas. First area, requirements. Second area, charter's obligations and responsibilities. And the third area, owner's obligations and responsibilities. And we'll take each of these in turn. The requirements. Well, charters shall supply compliant low sulphur fuel on board to reach the nearest bunkering port by January 2020. All residual high sulphur fuel is to be completely removed from the vessel by the 1st of March 2020, thereby meeting the carriage ban date. But also, the parties are to cooperate and use reasonable endeavours to have no residual high sulphur fuel on board by January 2020. Now we'll look at those in a bit more detail now. In terms of charter responsibilities, they can probably be broken up into 2 main areas. 1, an obligation to provide sufficient compliant fuel by January 2020. But 2, their responsibility to use and or dispose of residual high sulphur fuel under the charter party. Now, dealing first with the supply of compliant low sulphur fuel, there is no obligation only to have compliant low sulphur fuel on board by January 2020. This is because it was likely to be too onerous on charterers given the likely fuel price that we are going to see in Q4 2019 in order to be able to prescribe for that. Aside from that, we have to remember that it's also not mandatory under Annex 6 to have compliant low sulphur fuel on board before January 2020 anyway. Instead, the clause seeks to achieve a position where the parties are to use reasonable endeavours to consume all residual high sulphur fuel by January 2020 and minimise that amount on board. Now, this is highly recommended, but still needs to be agreed between the parties. And this is the kind of idea of a detailed plan that still needs to be agreed between the parties, which Rory will come on to later, in order to really affect the transition from high sulphur fuel to low sulphur fuel. And why do I say it's necessary or recommended to try and consume all residual fuel by January 2020? A simple reason. Between January 2020 and March 2020, It's only 2 months. You could have a cannonball effect of lots of people, lots of owners, lots of charters trying to get rid of that residual fuel in a very short space of period of time, where a lot of facilities may not be able to receive it. Unfortunately, the position is just unclear. At the moment, information is being collected as to various ports around the world as to how much compliant fuel there is, how much facilities there are. Sorry?
Just one question. It says in the B, no later than carried van, there should be no non-compliant fuel carried for use by the vessel. Does that mean you can carry non-compliant fuel as long as you can prove that you didn't intend to use it? You can just stuff it all in one bunker tank?
I think
In
presumably
theory.
a tanker, perhaps, doesn't it? I assume by that. So it could be an oil tanker, so you could be
So
carrying.
it's not talking about a bulk and you can put the non-compliant in as a
Both
segregated
things.
tank.
Both things.
You don't have to get rid of it.
Obviously, there are tankers, as Rory said, that carry high sulphur fuel as a cargo. But also, I understand from technical people that it is possible to have other different ways of storing that fuel, as long as you can show you're not going to use it.
You don't have to dispose of it by March 2020. Look, you could keep it on the ship, but as long as you can show you're not going to burn it.
The only issue would be, in most cases, it would be extremely difficult to do that, but there may be solutions to do that. So some people may have to go down that route.
Yeah.
Quite what type of vessels would be able to do that, I wouldn't have the expertise to say.
Because if say a bulker has 5 or 6 bunker tanks, they might be able to put, I don't know if that's an operational
You
question.
can blank things off and secure
Yeah,
them.
and you'd
but-
have an email correspondence, charters, owners say, well, we've got this in charter, well, please don't, we haven't got itinerary to dispose of it, please keep it in a segregated tank and confirm that you will not burn it or something like that. Would that not be sufficient to comply with?
Potentially, I mean, of course, the wording is for use as consumption on board the
Yeah.
vessel. So as long as you can prove that it's not, then in theory, it should be possible to do that.
Yeah.
The only one caveat to that, I would say, is that, of course, it will be down to the member state to ensure and enforce compliance and fines.
Yeah.
So they may have their own interpretation of what that means. And there's no hard and fast way. Yeah, there is a potential vulnerability.
Imagine how tedious that conversation would be at every port of call with the port state control
Yes.
inspector.
I mean, to take an example, in circumstances where around the world we have sought to take action against the vessel and sought to attach bunkers. In certain jurisdictions, those bunkers have to be offloaded ashore. And in those circumstances, normally it's extremely difficult. There's a lot of red tape to go through in order to get those bunkers off the vessel and ashore. So imagine that on a global basis.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure. I mean, local regulations are likely to play a very big
Well, that
role
would be
in
an
that
argument
as
for
well.
not for keeping if you couldn't dispose of them, you keep them
It
in the
would.
vessel, but you can prove that.
You could see arguments either way,
Yeah.
but lots of complications. I wish I had all the answers as well, but unfortunately, it is the hand that we've been dealt with at the moment. So yes, however, touching on the reasonable endeavours part, whilst that is recommended for the parties to try and seek to burn down high residual fuel oil up to January 2020, it's not a strict obligation. There is a strict obligation, however, to provide for charterers to supply sufficient amount of low sulphur compliant fuel in order for the vessel to reach the nearest bunkering port where compliant low sulphur fuel is also available. Of course, the problem here is identifying around the world those bunkers, those ports which will have sufficient low compliant fuel available at the time. And of course, we're a year in advance. We don't know those answers, but the reality is that kind of provision hopefully will provide assurances to the owners and the charterers that they'll be able to make it to the next bunkering port, although the quantitative amount may be an issue. So in practice, this will require charterers running down the residual high sulphur fuel oil, and then the bunker tanks being made fit as necessary, for example, cleaning, which we'll come on to by the owners, to receive and store that compliant fuel, and then the charterers resupplying sufficient amount of low sulphur fuel to meet their obligation under subclause BI. The second part of charterer's obligation, which we have touched upon, is in respect of residual high sulphur fuel. So with effect from January 2020, any high sulphur fuel remaining on board in bunker tanks shall be removed by charterers by the latest 1st of March 2020, or by the redelivery date, whichever happens first. Now the presumption, of course, as we've been over, is that the vessel will be running down that low sulphur compliant fuel in the lead up to January 2020. And then this will reduce the consequences or the potential consequences for charterers in this window period between January and March 2020. However, in terms of the scope of charterers' obligations, charterers are obliged to make the bunker tanks free from liquid and pumpable fuel. Now, this envisages that if there is, for example, unpumpable fuel residue, owners will be best placed to remove this as part of their tank cleaning obligation, if necessary, as part of subclause C2, which we will come on to. As for the importance of the words whichever occurs first, again, an important provision, but one which has the intention of trying to avoid redelivery disputes between January 2020 and that 1st of March 2020, that sort of hotbed period. Why? Because if redelivery takes place shortly before the carriage ban date in March, with a large quantity of residual high sulphur fuel on board, it would likely be the owners that have to dispose of such fuel themselves and face non-compliance if they did not do so. And they would have a limited time to do so in circumstances where they haven't even been employing the vessel. So it would require them to carry out bunkering operations and planning routes, which traditionally is more for that of charterers in a time charter party context. So all in all, I think this emphasises the importance of charterers planning the bunkering route and identifying those ports in advance, but not only to supply compliant low sulphur fuel, but also to receive residual sulphur fuel as well. Insofar as owners' responsibilities are concerned, bunker tank cleaning, that's the main one, and it falls within their responsibility as follows. This is because it's an operational activity best carried out by owners themselves. They know the ship, they understand the fuel management procedures, and represents effectively a trade-off and a fair allocation of risk and responsibility with charterers who, of course, are required to supply compliant low sulphur fuel and also to remove residual high sulphur fuel from the vessel. However, the obligation is purposefully not prescriptive. It does not indicate how, when and where this kind of activity needs to be carried out. And again, this is important because it's not a one situation fits all. There will be different requirements for different vessels depending on type, age, trade, and the chosen method of compliance. The scope of the obligation is to make the bunker tanks fit, taking into account the type of compliant fuel that will be loaded into those bunker tanks. So again, it will be determined on a case-by-case basis, and it will be the owner's time, risk and cost to decide what extent of tank cleaning will be required in the event. And as for unpumpable materials, we've covered that a short time ago, but owners would effectively be responsible for removing those to the extent that it was necessary, depending on what type of compliant fuel they were in fact using to replace fuel in that tank. It should also be noted that once the tank is fit or clean to the extent necessary, residual high sulphur fuel cannot then be reloaded into that tank. And again, this was thought to be a sensible provision because it would avoid further complications in due course, where, for example, an owner had already taken steps to clean such a bunker tank, and then they had the situation where they had to re-clean it after that high residual fuel had been loaded into such tanks. Again, this provision highlights the importance of early planning and being clear on the appropriate method of cleaning. And lastly, to minimise the risk of incompatibility between stems, subclause E provides for compliant low sulphur fuel to be bunkered into empty tanks within the vessel's natural segregation. Now this is because of two reasons. One, the concern over compatibility issues with new types of fuel on the market, hybrids and blends, which have been over. For example, a situation where you could, on the one hand, have compliant sulphur fuel, which still is on specification on grade, but because of additional properties that it has, makes it incompatible with other fuel stems. Secondly, because even oil companies themselves are reluctant to assure, even as of today, compatibility between the stems that they produce in terms of geographical location. Therefore, the sensible provision was to make sure that it was into empty tanks. However, there is a caveat to this, which is the words unless otherwise agreed by the parties. Of course, this envisages that it may not be necessary to empty the tanks in order to receive the compliant fuel coming on board. But this will depend on the type of compliant fuel being used, and there's little that we can really say on this at the moment, because there aren't effectively enough fuels on the market in order to take a view. And in any event, it would probably be an operational issue, which I would probably defer to most of you out there in terms of members. So at the moment, a lot of unknowns. Rory's mentioned the guidance from ISO that's still awaited, publicly available specification. So at the moment, the sensible provision was to make sure that it was fuel supplied into empty tanks. So where are we then? In terms of a summary of the BIMCO clauses, I would say, as part of the subcommittee, that they probably provide a robust contractual building blocks to achieve MARPOL compliance by key dates. It represents, on balance, a fair allocation of risk and responsibility that could be used in the Charter Party context. However, it is not the complete answer, as we've touched upon, and which we will discuss going forward, to solve all of the issues. I mean, it can't. For example, some of the issues it's impossible to resolve. Issues to do with availability of compliant fuel, the price of compliant fuel, which will effectively determine decisions that the parties make themselves outside of the control. Aside from that, further agreements are still likely to be required between the parties, probably a detailed plan in how those parties are likely to use the reasonable endeavours in order to make sure or try and work towards only low sulphur compliant fuel being on board by January 2020. Aside from that, a reasonable, fair and allocation of risk and responsibility may not reflect the commercial bargain between the parties. It may not be what they're after. And of course, we have provided various different solutions to clients to meet those issues. And of course, as we've covered in terms of the scope and application of the clauses themselves, they don't apply to all types of contracts. And on that note, I'll hand over to Rory to deal with the additional issues and considerations you want to bear in mind.
Okay, so just a few more slides now. What's not covered, we've talked about some of this already. It doesn't have a detailed plan in, and you definitely want a detailed plan. And what we've seen clients doing is adopting different plans for different types of ships. So some of the container line owners or charterers have done it on a port by port basis because it's more convenient for them to sort of do it as part of their schedule. Whereas if you're running a bulker or a tanker, you may prefer to complete a voyage, clean all the tanks, debunker, do it all in one go, and then start your next voyage with, compliant fuels throughout. The problem with all of this is timing, because obviously a charterer will want to leave all this till the last possible moment because of the fuel price differential, whereas an owner will want to do it in good time, and so there's a balance to be struck between the two. So as I say, that's one aspect. Do you do it in one go, or do you do it on a staged basis? The other thing is, do you try and cap the costs or share the risks? So we have seen charterers that are willing to share the cost 50-50 for the tank cleaning and everything else. We've also seen owners that have said, well, I want charterers to pay for all of this cost. Why should I be cleaning the tanks if it's on a long-term charter and we're only doing it because of a regulatory or bunker change, which is a charterer's issue? So I think depending on whether you're wearing owners or charterer's hat, depending on the nature of the contract, you can make different cases for who should pay, and you don't necessarily need to stick with the BIMCO formula, although you can use that to help you in negotiations. If we move on to, this is a clause that we drafted before the BIMCO compliance clause came out, and it's not necessarily better than the BIMCO clause, just different. It just gives a bit more detail in terms of what needs to be done. Also, owners have to pay for any modifications to the vessel. It sets out what the cleaning programme must include and what necessary cleaning is, and it sets out that owners will arrange for and pay for the cleaning. So this is obviously charter friendly, putting it all onto the owners. And then I think we've covered some of these, but we haven't mentioned, of course, that where you have an existing charter, you'll have differences between bunker prices on delivery and redelivery because of the change in price of fuel. So if your charter spans 1st of January 2020 and you're going to be redelivered afterwards, you need to work out a new clause for dealing with redelivery bunker prices and so on. Also the performance warranties we've discussed. If we move on very briefly now to scrubbers, you know about the different types of scrubbers. I think it's fair to say that open loop scrubbers are the most popular, although we've seen a lot of particularly container clients going for hybrid scrubbers, which I understand to mean they're open loop, but you've got the ability to convert them to closed loop. But when I say you've got the ability to convert them, it's not an easy ability to convert them. You still have to spend a lot of money. And then the most amusing phrase I heard from one tanker owner was scrubber ready for one of their new builds, and asked what that meant. And they just said some space on the deck around the funnel. So that's the cheapest option if you're looking for future proofing. And I think, as I say, open loop scrubbers are the most popular, maybe with the hybrid variety choice for compliance. But we have lots of bans now. We've got Singapore, China, US ports, Belgium, and today Fujairah was the latest port to do it. And this brings real problems because the whole benefit of a scrubber was, well, it's reasonably cheap, quick payback, big price differential on fuel. This is a good system, and it's easy to use because you just use high sulfur fuel all the time. But of course, the more ports that ban the use of open loop scrubbers, the less convenient it becomes because you have to have 2 lots of tanks, 2 lots of lines, changeover, crew training. You know, how do you ensure a changeover? Presumably, you have to switch over to low sulfur bunkers early enough to get all the high sulfur bunkers out of the system and out of the lines. So it really is a bit of a pain in the backside. And, you know, I would imagine the more ports that join this, and then we're still a year away from 2020, if this kind of exponentially keeps on growing, it may significantly reduce the sort of attractiveness of scrubbers. They do have a good economic case in many ways, which is why people have gone for them, but there is a big risk on regulatory uncertainty. Will they be banned completely, you know, by certain ports? That looks to expand public perception. We've had some clients that said they won't go for scrubbers because it doesn't look good from an environmental point of view if they're operating in Arctic environments or, you know, sensitive places. Space is an issue. Smaller tonnage, multi-purpose ships, small bulkers may not have space to fit scrubbers. The availability and the price of different fuels is going to be a big issue. People don't know that. And also the lack of availability now of scrubbers. You know, if you want to fit scrubbers to 20 or 30 ships now before the 1st of January, it's not going to happen because, you know, all the ship owners have gone around buying at the scrubber companies because they want to have capacity themselves in some cases. And also that the lifespan, we've seen scrubber warranties and specs where major parts are going to have to be replaced after 10 or 12 years. So, you know, how long are these things going to last for? How are they going to perform? It's all slightly unknown. And the capital cost is high. I mean, you're looking at, you know, at least a couple of million to fit them, plus time out of service, plus maintenance costs, spares, ongoing costs. It's not just a question of fitting them and then forgetting about them. It costs more to run them once they're fitted. And also insurance issues. So do you need to increase your whole value if the vessel's worth more? What happens in terms of P&I cover and defence if it breaks down? It's part of the ship, so logically it's covered. What about purchase options? If you've got purchase options in a long-term charter, do they need to be tweaked where you fitted a scrubber and so on? This is an example clause we fitted for a scrubber where this is charter friendly and it just shifts all the risk whatsoever onto the owners. It says if it breaks down, it's owner's problem. If there's any fines, it's owner's problem. If it doesn't work for a certain period, we can terminate. And the logic there is if you're paying a premium to get a vessel fitted with the scrubber, the risk of operation should be on the owner. But from an owner's perspective, do you want to cap your liability? Do you want to say, well, we don't take the risk of this technology, we don't take the risk of scrubbers, you know, the regulatory risk of scrubbers not being able to be used? And from an owner's point of view, you've got a huge exposure to damages because if you have a long-term charter and the scrubber's out of action for 6 months, you know, because of some lack of spare parts, you could potentially have to compensate the charterers for the difference between low and high sulfur bunkers for that 6-month period, which could be massive. So you've got to think about your exposure if you're fitting a scrubber and agreeing a charter clause with your counterpart from owner's side. And also, if it's a closed loop scrubber, how do you dispose of waste? Do you need charterers' cooperation in that regard? So fitting a scrubber, you can't have a standard clause, and I think this is why BIMCO haven't done one. You can try and think about standard issues, but you've got to look at the trade, the scrubber, and the commercial relationship. Reserve fuel is another issue with scrubbers, partly because of the ban. If you're going to fit scrubbers now, you really need to have a tank or tanks where you have reserve fuel, not just so that you can use low sulfur fuel when you come into a port where scrubbers are banned or open loop scrubbers are banned, but also what if you have a breakdown? You know, obviously if your scrubber breaks down, you can go to the port state control authorities and say, well, we would have complied, but the scrubber broke down. Much better though to have a reserve of low sulfur fuel that you can use as a kind of get you home tire to get you to the nearest bunkering port. But again, the issue there is charterers aren't going to want to pay for that. So does an owner pay for it and just have it on board and it's the owner's fuel? or do you write into the charter that the charter has to provide a certain quantity, and this all needs to be thought about and negotiated if you've got a scrubber. Final topic now is owners and charterers agreeing to fit and pay for scrubbers. We've seen three basic types of deal. The plain vanilla deal is where owner gets some money either from private equity, their own funds, or from a bank, and goes and buys a scrubber, fits it and charges the charterer more hire, either as standard increase on hire or as a sort of extra element for the scrubber working. That's the easiest deal. The second, more complicated, and the deal we've seen more often, is that the charterer goes out in some cases and signs the scrubber contract and assigns it to the ship owner. And you may ask, well, why would they do that? But some of the big container lines, they have the relationship with the scrubber manufacturers. It's easier for them to kind of contract for many, many scrubbers and then assign those over to particular vessel owners. But that does cause problems because, you know, who's taking the build risk, who gets the warranties, spare parts, all these sorts of things need to be dealt with. And then the third one, which is a little bit unusual, we saw recently that where you have an owner that agrees to fit them and finance them, but the charterer doesn't have to pay any more hire. But what the charterer agrees to do is pay 75% of the difference between the low sulphur and high sulphur charges to the owner as a sort of profit, sort of risk share element on it. So in effect, the owner fits the scrubber for free, and then the charterer basically coughs up the difference between low sulphur and high sulphur fuel. So the upside for the owner there is potentially a lot greater if there's a big price differential, and the saving for the charterer is they're only having to pay 75% of the difference between low sulphur and high sulphur fuel. The owner's giving them a sort of built-in 25% discount. So that was something we saw recently. The other problem is leasing houses want to get into this scrubber financing business, and some big charterers want to do that. But we've had real problems in achieving this because if you have an owner with a mortgage and a bank, and then the charterer comes along with a leasing house and says, let's put the scrubber on board, we'll sort it out with lease finance. You have a problem then because a leasing house will normally want to own the scrubber and have security rights over it. But then the ship owner's bank will want to have rights over the vessel and be able to sell it if they're in default. So then you need to start agreeing things like intercreditor deeds. Does the leasing house actually own it or not? Normally they'll have to own it. It all gets very complicated. So we do have a gap a little bit in the legal and financing world where owners may not want to finance scrubbers, but charterers or those other parties do. But then how do you secure title and deal with all of that? I won't go through all of this now, but where you are doing a deal, we've just put some issues to think about on the handout, which you can take away with you. Where you're looking to fit a scrubber and you're doing a deal where the charterer or the owner are fitting it, there's lots and lots of issues to think about. Who orders the scrubber? How do you pay for it? Do you pay it as an addition to hire? Do you pay the lump sum? And there's different arguments in favour of different things. If you're a charterer, you want to pay for it in hire, spread out over the whole lifetime of the charter. If you're an owner, what happens if the charterer breaches the charter halfway through, or you terminate? There's issues there, and you may want to say, well, if there's a default by a party, they have to cough up for the remaining share of the scrubber over the charter. Title and insurance we've already talked about, and security. And what is the spec? Are owners going to give a warranty about the performance of the scrubber, or are they just going to say, well, as I understand it, scrubbers can, they have certain specs and things. So in a charter, is it just going to be we're fitted with the scrubber, it's operational, or can a charter actually say, well, I want it to be able to perform at a certain level with certain usage of power and so on. We've talked about termination already, talked about purchase options. Does the charter need to be extended? Who takes regulatory risk? That's obviously a big factor. You may fit a scrubber and then find, say you fit a scrubber to a container ship and you find that on its regular service on 3 of the 5 ports, they're banned. How do you deal with that in that scenario as between owners and charterers? Do you have a right to terminate if the scrubber is not inoperable? What is the maintenance obligation? All of these things arguably need to be dealt with because they wouldn't be dealt with just on a standard wording. Obviously now we have the reserve fuel issue, tank cleaning, switching between fuels, to